Imagine spending decades collecting blood samples from every corner of the planet, sequencing millions of genetic markers from populations that had almost never interacted with modern science before, and finally, after all that work, discovering that the question you set out to answer was based on a false premise the entire time. That is essentially what happened when researchers compiled and compared the largest datasets of human genetic variation ever assembled. They were trying to understand the biological basis of race. What they found instead was a series of discoveries so counterintuitive that several of them are still misunderstood or flatly ignored in everyday conversation today. Here are 5 of the most genuinely shocking things this research revealed, counting down to the one that quietly rewrites your entire family tree. Number 5. The trait everyone uses to sort people into races is almost meaningless at the genetic level. For centuries, skin tone has functioned as society's primary shortcut for racial categorization, treated as though it reflects some deep, ancient biological divide between groups of people. The genetic data tells a completely different story. The mutations responsible for lighter skin tone in European populations are estimated to have emerged and spread within roughly the last several thousand years. A remarkably brief window considering that anatomically modern humans have existed for around 300,000 years. In evolutionary terms, that is closer to a rounding error than a deep ancestral split. Even more strikingly, the genetic mechanisms responsible for skin tone variation are not the same everywhere. Populations in South Asia and indigenous Australian communities both independently evolved deeply pigmented skin, despite having no significant shared ancestry and being separated by enormous geographic distance simply because both lived in regions with intense solar exposure. Yet different genetic mutations arrived at independently, producing a similar visible outcome. Researchers refer to this as convergent evolution, and it directly undermines the idea that shared skin tone reflects shared ancestry at all. Number 4, lactose tolerance scrambles the entire racial map. If race actually tracked clean biological lines, you would expect closely related traits to cluster neatly by geography and ancestry. Instead, the ability to digest milk into adulthood, a trait controlled by specific, well-understood genetic mutations, shows up in northern European populations, in certain East African pastoralist groups, and in some communities in the Middle East and Central Asia, while remaining largely absent in most East Asian populations and many populations within Africa itself, including groups geographically close to the ones that do carry the trait. The pattern has nothing to do with race and everything to do with culture. Lactose tolerance evolved repeatedly, independently, specifically in populations with a long history of dairy farming, regardless of what continent they lived on or what racial category later observers assigned them to. It is a trait shaped by historical lifestyle and diet, not ancestry. In the broad racial sense, most people assume. Number 3, the populations we lump together as a single race often contain more internal genetic diversity than entire other continents combined. Take the Han Chinese population, frequently treated in casual conversation as a single, broadly uniform ethnic and genetic group. Genetic research shows that the Han Chinese population actually represents centuries of merging between distinct northern and southern populations, unified gradually through imperial expansion, migration, and cultural consolidation, rather than shared ancient ancestry. The internal genetic diversity within that single population rivals the diversity found across the entirety of Europe, a continent most people instinctively treat as containing many distinct nationalities and ethnic groups. Compressing well over 1 billion people into a single, uniform racial category erases an enormous amount of real, measurable genetic variation hiding just beneath the surface. Number 2, the same disease-linked genes that seem to prove race is biological actually prove the opposite. This is the part that trips up even people who are otherwise convinced that race has no real genetic basis. Certain hereditary conditions genuinely do cluster within specific population groups. A gene variant linked to sickle cell disease appears more frequently in people with West African ancestry, while a different hereditary condition shows up at notably elevated rates among Ashkenazi Jewish populations, and yet another appears more often in populations with broadly European ancestry. At first glance, that looks like exactly the kind of evidence that would support treating race as biologically meaningful. But when researchers dug into why these patterns exist, they found something far more specific and far less tied to race than expected. The sickle cell-linked variant persists in West African populations because carrying a single copy provides real protection against malaria, a disease that was historically devastating across that specific region. Populations from any part of the world with a comparably long history of malaria exposure, regardless of which racial category they might be assigned, can carry similar protective genetic variants. These clusters trace specific historical disease pressures tied to specific regions and ecosystems, not broad racial categories. A West African population and a population from a historically malaria-prone region of southern Europe can share more relevant genetic protection against the same disease than either shares with a population classified as the same race, but descended from a region with an entirely different disease history. And number one, the discovery that quietly rewrites your entire family tree. Every person currently alive on Earth is far more closely related to every other person alive than almost anyone realizes. Genetic and statistical modeling of human ancestry suggests that the most recent common ancestor shared by any two living people, no matter how geographically or culturally distant they seem from each other, existed only a few thousand years ago. Trace the timeline back further to somewhere in the range of 5,000 to 10,000 years, and something even more striking emerges. Nearly every single person who lived during that window and has any descendants alive today turns out to be a direct ancestor of every single person currently alive on the planet. Not an ancestor of one nation, not an ancestor of one racial group, an ancestor of literally everyone, simultaneously, including you, and including every single person you have ever met. That single finding collapses the idea of separate, parallel ancestral lines running cleanly down through history into distinct racial groups. Your ancestry is not a straight line stretching back to one isolated population. It is an enormous, overlapping web that intersects with the ancestry of people you will never meet, on continents you may never visit, at points in the surprisingly recent past. Ancient DNA recovered from archaeological sites across Europe shows that modern European populations actually descend from a blend of at least 3 distinct ancestral waves. Early hunter-gatherer populations, farming populations that migrated in from Anatolia thousands of years later, and herding populations that arrived afterward from the Eurasian steppe. None of those original groups had any concept of a unified European identity, because that cultural category simply did not exist yet. The same layered pattern of repeated migration and mixing shows up in the genetic record of East Asia, the Pacific Islands, and the Americas. Every population, traced back far enough, turns out to be a blend of earlier populations that were themselves blends of even earlier ones. So why, if the genetic evidence points so clearly in this direction, did the concept of race as a fixed biological category take hold so firmly in the first place? The idea largely solidified during the 18th and 19th centuries, when European naturalists attempted to organize human populations into rigid categories the same way they classified plants and animals, ranking groups based primarily on visible physical traits and cultural differences. Those rankings were then used to justify colonization, forced labor, and discriminatory policy across multiple continents for generations, framed at the time as neutral, objective science. Modern genetics has not been kind to that framework. The traits used to construct those original categories show no meaningful correlation with intelligence, capability, or any other measure of human worth, and most of them are recent, localized adaptations to specific environments rather than deep markers of ancestral division. It is worth being direct about one thing here, because it matters, and it deserves more than a passing mention. None of this research erases the real, measurable social and historical consequences of how racial categories have actually been used. Centuries of policy, access to resources, and lived treatment have been shaped around those categories, and the effects of that history remain visible and significant today, regardless of what the underlying genetics show. Recognizing that race lacks a solid biological foundation does not erase that history, and it is not an argument for ignoring the real disparities it produced. What it does mean is that none of those disparities can be explained away as some kind of natural, inevitable, biologically determined outcome. There is no hidden genetic hierarchy sitting beneath human variation, waiting to be uncovered and used to justify how resources or opportunity are distributed. There is a bonus finding here too, one that did not make the official countdown but deserves mention because it shows just how creative evolution can get when the same problem shows up in 2 completely unconnected places. Populations living at extreme high altitude, specifically in the Tibetan Plateau and separately in the Andes Mountains of South America, both evolved genetic adaptations that allow their bodies to process oxygen more efficiently in thin mountain air, conditions that would cause serious health problems for populations adapted to sea level. Researchers studying both populations found that they arrived at broadly similar physiological outcomes through largely different genetic pathways, evolving independently in response to a shared environmental challenge rather than inheriting the trait from any common ancestor. It is convergent evolution playing out again, this time at the rooftop of 2 different continents, and it reinforces the same underlying point. Similar environments can produce similar biological solutions in completely unrelated populations, with no need for shared racial ancestry to explain the resemblance. Mixed ancestry itself turns out to be far more common and far older than most casual conversations about race assume. Consider populations across the Caribbean, where genetic studies consistently reveal ancestry drawn from 3 major sources simultaneously. West African populations brought to the region through the transatlantic slave trade, European populations connected to the era of colonization, and indigenous populations who inhabited the islands long before either group arrived. Most people in the region carry some combination of all three lineages, often in proportions that vary significantly even between close relatives. This is not a recent phenomenon caused by modern travel or globalization. Genetic mixing between distinct populations has been a constant feature of a human history for as long as different groups have come into contact with one another, whether through trade, migration, conquest, or simple proximity. The idea that any population today represents an unmixed, ancestrally pure lineage stretching back in an unbroken line does not survive contact with the actual genetic record. Almost anywhere researchers have looked closely enough to check. Ancient DNA recovered directly from skeletal remains adds another twist to this picture, one that surprised even researchers who already expected to find a complicated migration history. When scientists sequenced DNA from skeletons of the earliest known inhabitants of Europe, the hunter-gatherer populations who arrived not long after the last ice age began retreating, they found that those populations were not the direct ancestors of the people who live in Europe today, at least not primarily. Those original hunter-gatherer populations were substantially replaced over the following several thousand years by farming populations migrating in from Anatolia, in the region of modern-day Turkey, bringing agriculture and a different genetic signature with them. Then, a few thousand years after that, those farming populations were themselves partially displaced and absorbed by pastoralist groups migrating in from the Eurasian steppe, bringing yet another distinct genetic signature into the mix. Modern Europeans, genetically speaking, are a blend of all three of these waves, layered on top of each other over thousands of years, and none of those three original populations had any concept of a shared European identity, because that cultural category simply had not been invented yet at the time they were alive. This matters because it directly undercuts the casual assumption that any modern population anywhere represents a long, unbroken, genetically continuous line stretching back to some single point of origin. Population replacement and blending, on this scale, turns out to be closer to the historical norm than the exception. Similar layered replacement events show up in the ancient DNA record across other regions too, including parts of East Asia, where successive waves of migration and population mixing produced the genetic landscape researchers observe today, and parts of the Americas, where evidence increasingly suggests multiple distinct migration events rather than one single, simple movement of people across the land bridge from Siberia. The deeper paleogeneticists dig into the ancient DNA record, the more consistently they find the same underlying pattern. Very few, if any, modern populations are simply the unbroken genetic continuation of whoever happened to live in that exact location thousands of years earlier. For the overwhelming majority of human history, the broad racial categories that feel so fixed and obvious today simply did not exist in anything resembling their current form. Ancient societies certainly recognized difference in language, custom, and appearance, but they typically organized those differences around culture, religion, or political allegiance, not a rigid system of a small number of biologically fixed races ranked against one another. That specific framework, sorting humanity into a handful of supposedly distinct biological categories and arranging them in a hierarchy, solidified largely over the 18th and 19th centuries, developed by naturalists and early scientists who were, often explicitly, trying to provide intellectual justification for systems of colonization and forced labor that were already well underway. The science came after the system it was being used to defend, not before it. That sequencing matters enormously, because it means the racial categories most people still use casually today were never built primarily as an accurate description of human biological variation. They were built from the outset as a tool for organizing power, and the biology was retrofitted around that goal afterward. Once you understand that history, the genetic findings stop looking like a strange contradiction of common sense and start looking like exactly what you would expect. A system invented for one purpose, social organization and justification of hierarchy, simply failing to hold up once tested against a completely different purpose it was never actually designed for, accurately describing human genetic variation. There's a final piece worth sitting with before wrapping this up, because it reframes everything that came before it. None of these findings suggest that human populations are identical, or that visible physical variation between groups is somehow imaginary. The variation is real, measurable, and in some cases medically relevant. What the genetic evidence actually challenges is something more specific. The assumption that this variation sorts neatly into a small number of distinct, biologically meaningful categories that align with the racial classification societies have used for the last few centuries. Human genetic variation, when mapped honestly, looks far more like a continuous gradient, shifting gradually as you move across geography than a set of clearly bounded boxes. There is no precise genetic line where one race definitively ends and another definitively begins, because the underlying biology was never organized that way to begin with. The boundaries exist in our social categories, not in our chromosomes. That distinction, subtle as it sounds, has enormous practical weight. It means you cannot reliably predict someone's individual traits, risks, or capabilities from the racial box they have been placed in, because that box was built to track appearance and history, not the actual distribution of genes that matter for health, ability, or anything else. It means policies, assumptions, or beliefs built on the idea of fixed biological racial difference are standing on evidence that simply does not exist. And it means the actual diversity of the human species, the real variation worth understanding and even celebrating, is richer, stranger, and far less neatly organized than the handful of categories most of us grew up using to describe it. What the global comparison of human DNA actually revealed, when you strip away the assumptions, is something almost the opposite of what the researchers initially set out to confirm. Not a biological basis for race, but a quiet, thorough dismantling of it. Hidden in plain sight inside the genetic code carried by every single person alive today, including the person sitting closest to you right now, and including you.